There's a moment. You know the one. You're standing in the middle of a perfectly normal situation, a grocery store, a work meeting, your daughter's kitchen, and something shifts. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, just a quiet internal alarm that changes everything about the next 30 seconds of your life. And in those 30 seconds, you are no longer present in the conversation. You are doing calculations, distance, time, fabric, odds. You became very good at those calculations, didn't you? Without anyone teaching you, without anyone even acknowledging that this was something you'd need to learn. That's the part that stays with me. Not the inconvenience of it, the silence around it. The way millions of women navigate this every single day without ever saying the word out loud in a room where someone might actually help them. Menopause and urinary incontinence. One is driving the other more often than anyone tells you. And today, we're going to sit with that truth for a while, without rushing past it, without dressing it up. Just two women talking about something that deserves to finally be said clearly. Let me tell you something that was never in any pamphlet you were handed at your gynecologist's office. Your bladder has estrogen receptors. Not metaphorically, literally. The tissue lining your bladder, your urethra, your entire pelvic floor, it is studded with receptors that depend on estrogen to stay healthy, supple, responsive, functional.
And when estrogen begins to decline, which is exactly what perimenopause is at its most fundamental level, those tissues begin to change. Quietly, gradually, in ways that don't announce themselves until one day they do. The lining thins, the muscles lose tone, the signals between your bladder and your brain become less precise. What was once an automatic, effortless system starts requiring conscious management. And here's what I want you to really hear. This is not weakness. This is not your body failing you. This is biology doing exactly what biology does, responding to a shift in the hormonal environment that has governed your body since puberty. But understanding that doesn't make it easier to stand in the middle of a laughing conversation and feel your body make a decision you didn't authorize. So let's go deeper. Because most women, when they think about menopause, think about hot flashes, night sweats, mood changes, the things that get talked about, at least occasionally, in magazines and morning television segments. The bladder piece, that one stays in the dark, filed under embarrassment, managed in silence, with careful wardrobe choices and memorized bathroom locations. What's actually happening beneath all of that silence is this. Estrogen is the architect of your pelvic floor's integrity. For decades, it maintained the elasticity of the muscles, the sensitivity of the nerve endings, the thickness of the urethral lining that creates a proper seal.
It kept everything working together. Not perfectly, not without effort, but reliably. When estrogen withdraws, that architecture begins to shift. Think of it like a suspension bridge. For years, the cables were taut, balanced, holding everything in precise tension. Now, some of those cables are loosening. The bridge doesn't collapse, but it responds differently to weight, to pressure, to sudden movement. That's your pelvic floor right now. And this is where something like pelvic floor strong enters the conversation, not as a quick fix, but as a serious, structured approach to understanding how that bridge works, how to retension the cables that can be retensioned, how to work with the structure you have now, not the one you had at 35. Because incontinence during menopause isn't one single experience. It arrives in different forms for different women. There's stress incontinence, triggered by physical pressure, a laugh, a sneeze, a jump, a cough that comes out of nowhere. The sphincter, under sudden pressure, can't hold. There's urgency incontinence, the sudden, overwhelming wave that gives you seconds, not minutes. The kind that wakes you at 3 a.m. or hits the moment you put your key in the front door. And there's mixed incontinence, both layered together, unpredictable, exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. Knowing which one you're dealing with isn't just academic, it changes everything about how you address it.
And you deserve to know the difference. I want to say something that might land differently than you expect. The shame you feel around this, it was never yours to begin with. It was constructed, carefully, over a very long time, by a culture that taught women to be fluent in one particular language, the language of managing discomfort without burdening anyone else with the knowledge of it. You learned that language young. You've been speaking it ever since. And so you adapted, the way women always adapt, with extraordinary competence and zero acknowledgement. You learned which colors were safest, which routes had the most reliable bathrooms, which social situations were manageable, and which ones required a kind of advanced planning that nobody around you knew was happening. You became an expert in something you never wanted to be an expert in. And somewhere along the way, so gradually you might not have even noticed, you started saying no to things. Not dramatically, not in a way that made a scene, just quietly. The long hike with friends, the road trip without scheduled stops, the exercise class that involved jumping, the belly laugh that used to last until your eyes watered. You started editing your life in small ways that added up to something that felt, on certain days, like a smaller version of yourself. That's the part nobody talks about when they talk about incontinence, not the physical inconvenience. Women handle physical inconvenience with their eyes closed. The psychological cost, the slow, invisible contraction of a life lived around a limitation that was never properly addressed because it was never properly named. I think you know exactly what I mean, because there's a version of you that existed before the calculations started, before the wardrobe strategy and the bathroom mapping and the careful management of every situation that might catch you off guard. She didn't leave. She's just been waiting, with more patience than she should have needed, for you to stop pretending and start actually addressing this. So let's talk about what's really happening. Because estrogen decline is the foundation, but it's not the complete story. As estrogen drops, the urethral sphincter, the muscle responsible for maintaining that seal, that closure, that basic bodily reliability, loses tone. Not suddenly, the way everything in perimenopause happens, in increments small enough to explain away, until they're not. And simultaneously, the communication pathway between your bladder and your brain begins to shift. The bladder becomes more reactive, more impatient. It starts sending urgency signals earlier, louder, with less provocation than it ever needed before. 1 cup of coffee, the sound of running water, the cold air when you open the front door. Suddenly, these things have power over you that they never had before. It is not in your head. It is neurological. It is hormonal. It is structural. And it is real. This is also why practical support matters so much during this particular window of transition. Something like New Era Protect isn't about surrender. It's about refusing to let a transitional phase steal your confidence while you do the deeper work. There's a profound difference between a woman who is managing intelligently and a woman who has given up. One of them is still moving forward. You are still moving forward. The body you're living in right now is not a diminished version of something that used to be better. It is a body in the middle of one of the most significant hormonal transitions of a human life. And transitions, by definition, require more support than ordinary days. Not less dignity, more support. I want to tell you about something that happened to a woman I know. She was 54, successful, the kind of person who had navigated genuinely hard things in her life. Loss, reinvention, years of putting everyone else first, with a steadiness that people around her mistook for effortlessness. She told me that the bladder urgency started around the same time everything else started feeling like too much. The perimenopause symptoms, the sleep disruption, a job transition, her youngest leaving for college. And she said something I haven't forgotten. She said, "I couldn't tell anymore where the anxiety ended
and the bladder problem began. They felt like the same thing. She was more right than she knew.
Here's what the research quietly confirms, and what most doctors don't have time to explain in a 15-minute appointment. Your bladder is not just a storage organ. It is part of your nervous system's conversation with the world. And when that nervous system is running in a state of chronic, low-grade stress, which is exactly where many women in midlife find themselves, after years of absorbing and managing and holding everything together, the bladder picks up that signal. It becomes hypervigilant. It starts responding to perceived threat rather than actual need. So sometimes the urgency you feel has very little to do with how full your bladder is. It has everything to do with how activated your nervous system has been for longer than you've probably acknowledged. And menopause amplifies this, because menopause is itself a stressor on the body. The fluctuating hormones, the disrupted sleep, the unpredictable physical symptoms, they keep the nervous system slightly elevated, slightly braced. And a nervous system that is braced communicates that bracing to every organ it governs, including your bladder. This is why the women who make the most progress with incontinence are rarely the ones who only address the pelvic floor muscles. They're the ones who address the whole system, the sleep, the stress patterns, the breathing. Because how you breathe directly affects the pressure inside your abdomen, which directly affects your pelvic floor, which directly affects bladder control. It is all one conversation. And this is exactly the depth that Pelvic Floor Strong brings to the work. Not a list of exercises to do in isolation. A genuine understanding of how your body functions as a connected, pressure-sensitive, neurologically driven system. How the way you inhale before you lift something either protects or undermines your pelvic floor. How chronic tension in your hips and lower back is often the pelvic floor's way of compensating for instability it was never taught to address directly. These are not small details. They are the architecture of lasting change. There's something else I want to name, because it comes up more than you'd think. Anger. Not the hot, visible kind. The quiet kind. The kind that lives just beneath the surface of all that competent managing and adapting. The anger of realizing that you have spent decades taking care of your body in the ways you were told mattered, and nobody thought to mention that this was coming, that the pelvic floor would need specific attention, that the bladder would become this, that there were things you could have been doing, should have been doing, that nobody ever suggested. That anger is valid, and I think it deserves exactly one thing from you. Let it become fuel, not bitterness, fuel. Because the woman who is slightly angry about being kept in the dark about her own body, she's also the woman who, once she has the right information, does something with it. She doesn't wait. She doesn't minimize. She acts. That's you. I can tell, because you're still here. There's a word I keep coming back to when I think about what incontinence actually takes from a woman. Not comfort, not convenience. Spontaneity. The ability to say yes before you've run the calculations. The ability to be in a moment completely, not managing it from a slight distance, not half present because the other half of you is monitoring, bracing, planning the exit strategy. Spontaneity is the thing that makes a life feel lived rather than administered. And it goes so quietly. That's what makes it so insidious. Nobody takes it from you in one dramatic moment. It leaves in increments. The hike you declined, the concert you left early, the swimming you haven't done in 2 summers now, for reasons you've gotten good at explaining in ways that sound reasonable, but aren't quite true. You stopped jumping on the trampoline with your grandchildren. You stopped laughing without bracing. You stopped being the first one to suggest the road trip. And somewhere in that accumulation of small no's, something shifted in how you experienced yourself. Not your identity. You're still you, completely. But something in the texture of your daily life became more careful than you wanted it to be. I think about the pelvic floor differently because of this. Most conversations about pelvic floor health are clinical, anatomical. They talk about the muscles, the ligaments, the fascia, the pressure dynamics. All of that matters, and we've touched on it in this conversation. But what doesn't get said is this. Your pelvic floor is the physical home of your freedom of movement. When it's functioning well, you don't think about it. You just move. You just laugh. You just live. The body does its job invisibly, the way all the best systems do, silently, reliably, in the background. When it's not functioning well, it moves to the foreground. And suddenly, you are aware of your body in a way that is exhausting rather than empowering. Every movement becomes a negotiation. Every social situation becomes a risk assessment. That's not living. That's monitoring. And you have been monitoring for long enough. This is why the work of Pelvic Floor Strong is about more than physical rehabilitation. It's about returning something to yourself. Not the body of 20 years ago. That's not the goal, and it was never the goal. But the freedom to inhabit the body you have now without constant negotiation. To move through your days with the quiet confidence of a woman who knows her body, understands it, and has done the work to support it properly. That's a different kind of strength than the one fitness culture talks about. It's not visible. It doesn't photograph well. But it shows up in the way you carry yourself, in the spontaneous yes you say on a Thursday afternoon when someone suggests something you would have declined 6 months ago. It shows up in the laugh you don't brace for. And alongside that deeper work, the daily reality matters too. New Era Protect exists for the woman who is rebuilding, who is doing the work, making the changes, learning her body's new language, and who also needs to move through her days with confidence right now, not only after the rehabilitation is complete. Both timelines are real. Both deserve support. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually sit with it rather than answer it quickly. What is the one thing you stopped doing? The specific thing, the one that comes to mind immediately, that you would go back to if you knew your body would support you. Hold that thing in your mind for a moment, because that thing, that's not a memory of who you were. That's information about who you're working toward being again. And the distance between where you are now and that thing is smaller than the silence around this topic has led you to believe. I want to talk about what actually changes things, not in theory, in practice, in the real life of a real woman who is navigating this while also managing everything else that doesn't pause because her pelvic floor needs attention. The first thing that changes things is deciding to stop waiting for it to resolve on its own. I know that sounds simple. It isn't, because waiting feels reasonable when a symptom comes and goes, when some days are better than others, when you can almost convince yourself that it's not that bad, that you're managing, that maybe it will just stabilize. But the pelvic floor doesn't restore itself through patience alone, and the bladder doesn't retrain itself through wishful thinking. The nervous system doesn't recalibrate simply because you've decided to worry about it less. What they respond to is attention, consistent, informed, compassionate attention. And that starts with awareness, not the anxious kind, where you're monitoring every sensation with dread, but the curious kind. The kind where you start noticing patterns without immediately judging them. You notice that the urgency spikes on high stress days, that it's worse after a poor night of sleep, that certain foods reliably shift things in one direction or another, that the mornings after you've done your pelvic floor work feel measurably different from the mornings you skipped it. You start to see the connections. And once you see them, you stop feeling like a passive victim of your own body. You start feeling like someone who is learning a language, imperfectly, gradually, but genuinely. That shift from victim to student is where real change begins. The second thing that changes things is understanding that the pelvic floor needs to be retrained, not just strengthened. This distinction matters more than most women realize. Strength without coordination is not the goal. A pelvic floor that can contract powerfully but can't fully release is actually part of the problem, not the solution. Tension and weakness can produce identical symptoms,
And treating tension with more contraction is like tightening a knot that's already too tight. This is the nuance that pelvic floor strong is built around. The understanding that the pelvic floor is a dynamic, responsive system that needs to know when to engage and when to let go, that needs to coordinate with breath, with posture, with the specific pressure demands of real daily life. Not just isolated exercises performed lying on a mat, but functional movement patterns that translate directly to the moments that actually matter. The sneeze, the laugh, the lifting of a grandchild, the morning run you want to go back to. The third thing that changes things is addressing the bladder directly. Bladder retraining is one of the most underutilized and most effective tools available to women dealing with urgency incontinence. The process is straightforward in concept and requires genuine discipline in practice. When urgency arises, you don't immediately rush to the bathroom. You pause. You breathe slowly and deliberately. You perform a gentle pelvic floor contraction, not a forceful grip, but a calm, controlled lift. And you allow the urgency wave to pass. Because urgency is a wave. It rises, it peaks, and it subsides. And each time you ride it, rather than panic into it, you are teaching your nervous system something new. You are demonstrating, through action, that the urgency is not an emergency. Over weeks, not days, weeks, the bladder learns. The intervals between genuine need lengthen. The urgency waves become less overwhelming. The sense of being controlled by your own body begins to loosen its grip. This is not magic. It is neuroscience. It is the brain's capacity for adaptation, working quietly in your favor when you give it the right conditions. And while you are doing all of this deeper work, the retraining, the rehabilitation, the patient, unglamorous rebuilding, your daily life continues. You still have places to go, people to see, moments you don't want to miss because you're afraid of what might happen. This is where New Era Protect serves something important, not as a crutch, not as an admission of defeat, as a bridge, the practical, dignified support that allows you to show up fully in your life right now while the longer work unfolds in the background. There is nothing contradictory about using protection while rebuilding strength. A woman recovering from a knee injury doesn't refuse a brace because she's also doing physical therapy. She uses both, intelligently, without shame. You deserve the same intelligence applied to this. The fourth thing, and this one is the quietest and perhaps the most important, is changing the story you tell yourself about what is possible. Because somewhere along the way, many women absorb a narrative that goes something like this. This is just part of getting older. This is just what happens. This is something you manage, not something you solve. That narrative is not accurate, and it has cost women years of unnecessary limitation. The pelvic floor responds to training at every age. The bladder can be retrained at every age. The nervous system remains capable of learning new patterns well into the 7th and 8th decades of life. The science on this is not ambiguous. What is ambiguous, what has always been ambiguous, is whether anyone will bother to tell you. Consider yourself told. I want to pause here for just a moment, not because we're done. We're not. There's something I still need to say, and I think it might be the most important thing in this entire conversation. But first, if you have been here with me this whole time, through the biology, through the emotion, through the parts that maybe landed closer to home than you expected, I want you to know that means something. Not everyone stays. Not everyone is ready to sit with this honestly. You stayed. That tells me you're ready. So if this channel isn't already part of your life, I want to invite you to make it one. Subscribe. Join us. Because this is what we do here. We talk about the things that happen to women's bodies after 45 with the seriousness and honesty they deserve. No glossing over. No minimizing.
No pretending that the hard parts aren't hard. And leave me a comment below. Tell me something real. What part of this conversation touched something you've been carrying quietly? I read every single one. And sometimes just seeing your own experience reflected back in someone else's words
makes the whole thing feel a little less like something you're going through alone, because you are not alone in this. And that brings me to what I still need to say. We've talked about the biology, we've talked about the nervous system, we've talked about retraining and rebuilding, and the slow, quiet work of learning a body that is changing faster than anyone prepared you for. But underneath all of that, underneath the science and the strategies and the practical tools, there is something more fundamental happening to you right now. You are being asked by your own body to pay attention in a way you never had to before. And I think that's worth sitting with. Because the women I've seen make the most profound shifts during this time, not just with incontinence, but with their relationship to their bodies overall, are not the ones who found the perfect program or the perfect product. Though those things matter. They are the ones who stopped treating their body like an inconvenience to be managed and started treating it like a conversation worth having. Your body has been speaking to you. The urgency that wakes you at 3 a.m., the leak that happens when you laugh too hard.
The heaviness you feel after a long day on your feet. These are not random malfunctions. They are a system trying to communicate with you in the only language it has. And here is what it is saying, beneath all the inconvenience. I need your attention. Not your frustration, not your shame, your attention. That attention, directed, informed, and compassionate, is what pelvic floor strong is built to channel. It gives your attention somewhere specific and effective to go. And New Era Protect gives you the daily confidence to stay present in your life, while that attention does its work over time. Neither one is the whole answer. Both are part of the same answer. And the answer begins the moment you decide that your body deserves the same quality of care you have spent a lifetime giving to everyone else. That moment can be right now. I want to end simply, not with a summary, not with a recap of everything we covered, just with something true. The way things that actually matter tend to get said, quietly, without ceremony. You have been living in a body that is changing, and you have been doing it, for the most part, without a map, without adequate warning, without the kind of honest conversation that might have made the whole thing feel less like something was going wrong and more like something was simply, inevitably, moving forward. Nobody sat you down and told you this was coming. Nobody explained what estrogen leaving would do to the tissues that held everything in place. Nobody mentioned the bladder, the pelvic floor, the nervous system running hot in the background of a life that never actually slowed down enough to let you catch your breath. You just woke up one day, and the calculations had already begun. And you adapted, the way you always have, quietly, competently, without making it anyone else's problem. But here's what I want you to hear. Really hear. Not just process and move past. The adapting was never the problem. The silence around it was. Because in that silence, something happened that nobody named and nobody measured. You started taking up less space. Not all at once, gradually, in the way that only becomes visible when you finally stop and look back at the distance between who you were and who you've been allowing yourself to be. The spontaneous yes you stopped saying, the laugh you learned to swallow before it could betray you, the version of yourself that used to move through rooms without running calculations first. She didn't leave. She's just been waiting, with more patience than she should have needed, for you to come back to her. That's what this has all been about. Not the pelvic floor as anatomy, not incontinence as a clinical category to be managed and filed away, but the quiet, accumulated experience of a woman who deserves to feel completely at home in her own body, without the low hum of management. Without the careful, invisible architecture of avoidance she built so well that even the people closest to her never noticed it was there. The work ahead of you is not glamorous. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't photograph well. It happens on a Tuesday morning before anyone else is awake, when you do the work anyway. It happens in the moment urgency rises, and instead of panic, you breathe, and you wait, and you discover, again,
that you are more in charge than the silence ever let you believe. It accumulates, slowly, the way all real change does. And then one day, not a dramatic day, not a day you marked on the calendar, just a regular Wednesday, the kind that doesn't ask anything particular of you, you will realize that you haven't run the calculations in a while, that you laughed without bracing, that you said yes without planning the exit first, that you moved through a room the way you used to, fully, freely, without the part of you that was always slightly somewhere else, always slightly managing. You won't make a ceremony of it. You'll just notice. And in that noticing, in that quiet, ordinary, completely unremarkable moment, something will settle in you that has been waiting a very long time to settle. That is not a small thing. That is actually everything. Take a breath. And when you're ready, if this conversation reached something real in you today, if something here finally named what you've been living without quite having the words for it, I want to ask you to do one thing. Share this video with 5 women in your life. Not for me, for her. The one in your circle who has been managing this in silence, who has been shrinking in her own quiet way, who doesn't know yet that there is real information, real support, and a real path back to herself available to her right now. You could be the person who reaches her today. That matters more than you know. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We'll be here every week talking about what actually happens to women's bodies after 45 with the honesty and depth that you have always deserved and rarely been given. And leave me a comment, a real one, not just about the video, about you. Tell me what landed. Tell me what you're still carrying. And tell me what you want us to talk about next. What question has been living quietly inside you, waiting for the right place to finally ask it? I'll be reading every single one. I'll be thinking about you. And I'll see you in the next one.